us. We have an amazing panel here for you today. This is not about pomp and circumstance, but this really is about us understanding what's in front of us and how we need to come in space to really support movement organizations on the ground. We have said, we left the title to this session very simple, because we are here to really figure out how we collectively as funders need to support, build, and organize the infrastructure around movement organizations so they can do the work. We're not the ones doing the work. They're on the ground doing the work. So we need to position ourselves to be in the best place, to support them. So a lot of you want to understand, like, what is this about? Like, what are we talking about in this webinar? And for us, everyone has ideas of what they mean around power building, and what they mean around capacity building, and what they mean around movement organizations. Well, we want to talk a little bit about what that means for us. And when we're thinking about how we're organizing ourselves within GSP to build community and to make sure that there's space for community to connect and align directly with funders, we create that space because we want funders to be clear about what it's going to take to fund and move this work. So when we think about power building, we're thinking about those communities and how they have organized themselves and their tools and the resources that they have to really realize the visions that they've created. You know, no funder should be in any space, anywhere, talking about the visions that they've created for communities in the South. That's not what we do. What we do is give the tools and the resources that communities say they need so that they can create and dream their own visions and put them in place so that they can become a reality. But we also want to make sure communities have the ability to set the agenda and change systems that allow them to build the political power, create economic opportunity and social inclusion for communities where they live, they work, and where they have to nurture their families. And most importantly, we want to create the space for communities to hold these systems and institutions accountable for how they govern, interact, and move within community. You know, those things are about what power building is really about. It's really about making sure community has the space to exercise its own voice and its own power to do the things that it sees it needs to do for itself and for the future of its families. And as funders, our role is to center those communities. Our role is to center those organizations and make sure that the infrastructure around those communities are strong and that they have all the resources that they need to build their capacity, to realize those goals, and to organize community in the ways in which they need to. So that's what we're talking about today. And when we're talking about capacity building, so this is a big thing. I really want us to touch on this a little bit, and we're going to really go in deep around this in the conversation that we're going to have today. You know, when we think about capacity building, sometimes as funders, we think about the organizational structure. We think about strong boards. We think about the organizational systems, the organizational life cycle, and the ability to have those things in place to create sustainability. Facts, all those things are true. But for community, capacity building goes a little bit further. It's more than just the internal infrastructure, it's the external infrastructure. It's those things that are in community that we have no clue about that need to be in place for communities to really do their job and fulfill the missions of their organizations. And those things can't be prescribed by funders. Those things are things that we have to ask communities directly. What is capacity building for you? What does it look like internally? What does it look like externally? And how do we support you in making sure you have what you need to properly build your capacity to do the work? That's the frame that we as funders need to approach this work, and allow communities to say whether it makes sense to us or not, allow communities to say what it is they need to really build their capacity. Is that cool? And we have folks on here that will talk about the work and talk about how we can realize these things. But I just wanted to make sure that people understand that capacity building is not a simple definition or a simple thing that we could prescribe and communities say, we say simply, this is what it is and this is all that we're funding. And that when we fund these things, that we fund all of it, that we provide long-term general operating grants, convening resources, leadership development, organizational development, organizing infrastructure, everything they could possibly need to grow and sustain the work that they're moving. And our role is to support that and to do that. And then last but not least, they've said, well, what is movement organizations? And y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, but when I think about what are movement organizations, they are Black-led, power building, queer, trans, women-led organizations that are based in the South, that are working in relationship with others to address the injustices facing the communities that we serve in the South. So for me and for GSP, that's the basis where we're going to start this conversation. And we're going to open it up to our panelists to give them the opportunity to talk more about it and to even correct me if they feel like, well, Tamika, you missed something. Let's talk about it. Let's figure out what it is together so that communities can have the support and resources they need to do this work. So let's transition to panel introductions. And so I'm going to take a moment and Elizabeth, if you can pin folks, I'm going to let everyone take about 2 minutes to introduce themselves as we bring them up. The first person on the panel is Melanie with the Hive Foundation. If you can pin Melanie and give her an opportunity to introduce herself.
Okay, I don't want to go ahead of protocol, but I'm just start talking and I'll get pinned when I get pinned. Perfect. Hi, my name is Melanie Allen. I use she, her pronouns. I am one of the founding co-directors of the Hive Fund for Climate and Gender Justice. I am also co-chair of the steering committee for Grantmakers of Southern Progress. And I see a lot of my Cypress fam on the call as well. And so I'm also, I guess, vice chair of the Cypress Fund and Road Funds, which are two visionary funds rooted in, supporting the kind of self-determining visions that Black, Brown, Indigenous communities in the Carolina have for ourselves. Today I will talk, I guess, begin wearing my Hive Fund hat. The Hive Fund for Climate and Gender Justice is a 2.5-year-old intermediary fund. We're a specialized regranter, raise money and make grants to groups that have historically lacked the access to funding and are addressing intersecting climate, racial, and gender justice issues in the South. When I talk and think a little bit about kind of the need for our work or why it feels important for us, it really is because we know that not only have these groups been under-resourced, but that the work that they do, the visions they have for their own communities, not only will they make them healthier, safer, less vulnerable to both climate causing pollution, but also the climate catastrophe that we're all experiencing more and more regularly, but they also make us all safer because about 40% of US pollution is happening across 13 states. And if you think about those numbers, 13 states in the US South responsible for about 40% of US pollution, then we know that there's no path.
Get out.
There's no path to climate action. There's no path to durable climate action in the US that does not come to the South. And so we're working to resource frontline communities to lead that work, because we know that not only do we have the most to gain, we also have the most to lose and the most at stake. So I'll leave it there. And we'll talk more later.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Next, we'll have Kaji Reyes of Durham For All. If you can please come on and introduce yourself and your organization, that would be great.
Awesome. First, thank you, Tamika, for such a wonderful, open introduction for everybody, and to Amber and Elizabeth for helping create this space. I'm excited to be here. Again, my name is Kaji Reyes. I am the executive director of Durham For All, which is a grassroots organization that's building a cross-class, multiracial movement in Durham. And one of our long-term goals is to build a base of 10,000 people strong, because we know that if we have 10,000 people committed to taking action together consistently and persistently over time, we would be able to get folks elected, unelected, hold folks accountable, and be able to pass policies that actually our folks really need for their daily lives to be just in a better place. We do this all through issue-based organizing and electoral-based campaigns, because we see that every issue is a political issue. Some of the work that we're doing around the local level is focused around 6 different areas that both hold our beliefs and our vision for what a Durham should be. I have a whole list of things that kind of break these things down. I know we don't have as much time, so I'm just going to run through the list and then share some of the things that we were able to do. But there's homes, healthcare, education, economy, sanctuary that's really like deserving to feel safe and secure in people's own bodies, our homes and our communities, really pushing for the policies that promote real community safety. Democracy, and this is about expansion of democracy. Democracy belongs to everybody who lives here. We deeply believe that, whether you're native, refugee, immigrant, Black, brown, Latino, Muslim, white, Jewish, documented or undocumented, LGBTQ folks, we all need those voices at the table to create this Durham that is for everybody. So I want to share a little bit about the work we've been able to accomplish around some of those areas. We're able to accomplish a $95 million municipal housing bond in Durham, which is not only the largest in Durham, but the largest in North Carolina. We're able to get some of these, to get these wins by organizing, building our folks up, really doing a deep dive in leadership development, and doing both issue-based advocacy work and electoral organizing. So we were able to establish a participatory budgeting process that's 2.4 million in Durham, where folks who were, regardless of their citizenship status, were able to vote if you were 12 or older about where our money and our resources go. That is the largest participatory budgeting in North America. I looked it up today, I couldn't find anything that said different, so I just want to like lovely claim that very deeply. And we were able to create and support the funding of a Department of Community Safety and Wellness department in Durham. Other cities across the South have been doing this. And basically for us in Durham, we know because the city did a research plan around fielding 911 calls, that more than 90% of those calls don't require somebody who needs to show up who has a gun. So we want to be giving folks their the care that they actually need. And some of that is having mental health care workers show up, caseworkers, other forms of support to be able to get the support that they need when they call. Yeah, the last thing that I'll share is just that actually we elected a district attorney who is really focused on transforming the justice system, really being able to successfully petition the court to waive 2.7 million in unpaid traffic court debt, preventing more than 11,000 people here in our home, or enabling 11,000 people to get their licenses back. So really just transforming people's daily lives. There was a guy on the paper who shared that he hadn't had his license in 20 years. Can you imagine having to ask for a ride and ride the bus for 20 years when you had a license at one point and you were able to have that access and that freedom? So I'll stop there. I know I got a lot to say, y'all. I'm super excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaji. And I'll turn it over next to Paulina, who's with the Foundation for Just Society.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be with you all today. Thank you so much for the invitation to GSP. My name is Paulina Helm-Hernandez. I go by she and her. I'm calling y'all from my little home office in Louisville, Kentucky. Foundation for a Just Society is based out of New York City. and we're a global feminist foundation that essentially our donor, Audrey Capel, started a foundation in 2011, a private foundation, to really begin to sort of look at what were the sort of, to learn actually more about the human rights conditions of marginalized girls, women, and LGBTQI people. Sort of, I would say out of her feminist values, to really sort of want to support what was happening, particularly in the gender justice space. And since then, we've been able to move about $180 million globally to support movements that are led by and for marginalized women, girls, and LGBTQI people. I manage our US Southeast portfolio in particular. That's my official title. Sorry, I should have said that earlier. I'm program officer for the US Southeast portfolio at FJS. So it just means that I'm working with a really amazing set of global grant makers and that are thinking about sort of what are different regions around the world really. What are some of the conditions that are creating inequality around the world and oppression? And what are some of the ways that that movements are intervening on those conditions? And so, just to mention the other places that we fund in support work in Francophone West Africa. And I started supporting work in Mesoamerica, in Central America that expanded to Mesoamerica. We also support work in South and Southeast Asia. And we also support global collaborations to help to bring all of our grantee partners together, or try to bring sort of coordinating global efforts to try to redistribute more resources into the hands of feminist movement building. And I joined FJS about 4 years ago, so I'm about 4 years into a 5-year grant making strategy that's very focused on the US Southeast and very focused on, oh my God, if Dami is getting a call, sorry. One of the things that we're really focused on, honestly, has just been I come out of movement building myself. I come out of organizing. I see a few people that I've known since I was a teenager. I see you over there, Margarita Romo, who's known me since I was a teenager. And honestly, like organizing in the Southeast, like that is a lot of what you learn, like growing up in the South, is that like it takes more than one person to do anything good. It takes many of us to do the work of movement building. It takes many of us to confront white supremacy and white nationalism. And that part of what the South is really well positioned to do is actually to just learn from its history, to learn from the conditions that have created oppression and inequality, structural inequality in this country, and to actually be able to really counter that at the root, if that makes sense. So to me, I'm like, it's been something that's been really humbling, to be honest, like as somebody that has worked a lot with communities that are facing oppression and inequality, that are really thinking about what does power mean, right? And for many of us, like that come out of the South, we know that the power lies in the power of collaboration, and the power of coexistence, and the power of multiracial movement building, and the power of political unity, because that's what's actually made our lives possible for many of us. So for me as a Southern grant maker, like I really have been very focused on what does it mean to leverage as much as many national and global resources into supporting the Southeast, into actually understanding the ecosystem for creating social change in the Southeast. What are some of the ways that communities themselves have empowered themselves, have created their own resources? That's what's so great to hear from Melanie. It's so great to hear from Kaji, because I'm like, so communities that have created, like y'all come out of efforts that have created the infrastructure that our people needed, that we're not looking to national foundations or global forces to sort of make that happen. And then our job is to just see that, recognize that, so show some love and respect, and help to resource that and sustain that. Because so much of what, in my experience in the last 4 years, like just been really humbled, y'all. Like I feel like I came into philanthropy with like a lot of my own assumptions based on doing many, many years of fundraising and development work in the service of migrant justice, and the service of racial justice work, and the service of feminist movement building. And I think having a real misread in some ways about how money moves, right? And like what is sort of, like giving in some ways like the power that oftentimes that sits within philanthropy, but that is also in so many ways like it actually, like the power of movements is so much of what we want to be able to highlight. Like the power to actually intervene on some of the conditions that have been created right now lies with movement. And the way that we are able to sort of play a role in helping to resource that is, I feel like, where our power really lies, because this country tells itself, this narrative around like money is power, and so what does that mean for people that are structurally locked out of having access to resources? What does it mean when like there's such a consolidation of wealth based on our ancestors suffering on their, like, so to me, like I feel like a role that particularly Southern grant makers and people that care about investing in the South, the role that we have to do, our role to like help recognize the history that has created those conditions, and what are some interventions that are really visionary, are actually trying to create and sustain more political autonomy for movements in the region that shouldn't be beholden to private interest, shouldn't be beholden to private philanthropy, but that we have seen a mass of people enter also, I would say, social justice philanthropy that have already been politicized by white supremacists, have already been politicized by homophobia and transphobia, and have made a decision about what role they're willing to play. So it's just been awesome, honestly, to like recognize people in the field that I'm like, they are not confused about what you're doing. They are not confused about what kinds of organizations are really trying to intervene. They're not confused about what kinds of leaders are trying to really build a table for the many and move away from the exclusive sort of politics or narrow politics that exclude our masses or like broader communities that really are also that are looking to empower their communities, are also wanting to be in unity with other fights that are really helping to create space for more of us at the table. So I have a lot of thoughts and reflections about it as well. Kind of, you're like, I have a lot of thoughts about this. And, you know, also I sit on the board of funders for LGBTQ issues. So definitely that's one of our sort of brain think spaces, also to be able to support, learn honestly, like from other LGBTQ grant makers and other people really focused on supporting the LGBTQ movement about what are ways that we could be more proactive to support things that have been like historically under-resourced. You know, one example of that is trans-led movement and movement building. And a lot of the work that happens within the, a lot of the work to confront the gender binary, and a lot of the work to really confront sexism and homophobia and transphobia and misogyny in our country is oftentimes be led by non-binary people, by folks that are, very much oftentimes being included from also formal sources of funding, or their organizations are not being invested in the way that we are. So that's one example, or one of the things that we recognize where there's just been like severe under-resourcing that we want to have sort of a more focused sort of approach around and collaboration around with other folks that are also seeing some of the same things that we are seeing. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, and that's actually a perfect segue. Like, I think let's continue that conversation, because I think, Paulina, you lifted up some very important things for us to be thinking about. So Melanie and Kaji, as you're thinking about what Paulina just shared, what are the other things that we're seeing across the South that we need to be paying attention to? And how can we work together as funders and practitioners to bring results to some of these things?
One, just like snaps to everything that Paulina has lifted up. Thank you so much for, I think, all that you shared there. As I am thinking about like some of the trends that we're seeing, I don't think that they're surprising to anyone. I have the pleasure right now to be in the midst of a solidarity tour where we're going to see about like each and every one of our grantees across the region. And so, I think one of the things that we're hearing is just that people are tired and stretched, and that even as or if budgets are growing, so is the opposition, so is the work that they're asked to do. And so really what we're hearing from grantees is like, what does it look like to have space to take a pause, to care for our people, and, to really take care of the humans that are doing this work, and not just be seen as like building power for someone's like outcomes, but to really think about and consider the people that are doing this work. I think the other thing that we're hearing and seeing so consistently is like greater attention needs to be paid to security. And, from doxing of workers and organizers to people following folks home to, even like our organizations, when people are hiring, being infiltrated by folks that the opposition are sending to try to get inside of our organizations. One of the things that we're paying particularly close attention to and that we're hearing is that security is a growing and increasing concern. And then another thing I'll say that we're hearing that's a trend from our organizations is that organizations that were founded on the principles of social justice, of racial justice, that have been doing this work, that often we're doing it with very little budgets, right? Breathe it, understand, have had the capacity to bring on staff now, have trained them up so that they're really well respected and doing incredible work in the field. And now that social justice is sexy, we're seeing a lot of organizations that were not traditionally doing this work, right? Who have budgets that are 10 or 100 times the size of these organizations, that are now like, dangling these carrots. And so folks are losing staff. And it's a really difficult position to be in, right? Because you're like, oh, we want people to have great salaries. We want, folks to, have the space to do all of this work. And, the reason that like these organizations are able to, I think, pull staff away is because like folks can't compete on price, because you have this historic disinvestment, right? That even if budgets are growing now, like they are not anywhere near the magnitude of some of these like traditionally white-led organizations that were not doing anything last year or maybe 5 years ago around justice. And so it really is, this question of like, okay, either how do I reorient and just rock with the fact that we're going to have wonderful, brilliant staff that we have for 2 to 3 years. We train up to be very well, and this is a service that we provide to the field. Or really our work as funders is, what does it look like to continue to grow that pie so that folks can afford to retain their people and that people can afford to do this work, and not make the continuous sacrifices, right, that we've always made to our families to do this work and be in these fights long term. And so I'd say that those are just kind of 3 trends that we're hearing, seeing deeply from grantees that, kind of run the gamut of issue.
And Kaji, before you, one sec, if everyone, because we really want everyone to be able to hear and get the full breadth of what everyone is saying. If you're not on the panel, if you can temporarily mute yourselves, so that when background conversations happen, it doesn't disrupt, that would be amazing. I'm so sorry. So Paulina, Kaja, if there are other trends or things that you are seeing around the South that you haven't already lifted up, please take the opportunity to talk about them now. And let's think about how we can work on these things together as funders and practitioners. If there's things that you all can lift up around that, that would be great as well.
All right, Paulina's giving me a go ahead. So thank you for that. Yeah, Melanie, I think what you're sharing around a trend of, and what we're experiencing is like major institutions or donors are like, I want to fund the big work, so more like national work. And what that does is it makes smaller organizations, because we're a countywide organization, have to vie and compete with those larger just budgets and rates of pay, which is just not possible sometimes. So I'm glad that you lifted that up. I think we're, just to share with y'all, we experience that as well. I think some of the other trends that we're seeing is, there's a lot of voter suppression laws. There's a lot of purging of people's voices through the voter rolls. The kind of idea that if you don't use your vote, you lose your vote. So if you don't vote several years in a row, they purge you, and you don't know until you go to vote and you're like, oh, it's too late to register. So there's all these different ways that the right has kind of suppressed voting rights and and have kind of stolen narratives around wins that, oh, if the win isn't the way that we decided it should be, it's stolen. And so, those are some kind of trends in what we're seeing around our work, and things that we think that are potential ways to move forward together is actually, some of it's real simple. Join organization. Get involved, support organizations doing outreach and base building, push for the importance of unrestricted funding, both C3 and C4, partisan political funding. So one of the ways that I see that our power is sterilized is by not actually contesting for political power. And I say that because often what we set out to do and what we had the resources to do don't actually match up. So when I first moved to North Carolina, I got involved in an education campaign that was pushing back against the defunding of public school budgets each year. And we gathered together, we organized, we did all these beautiful actions together, and we put pressure on the county manager, and we were successful at saving over 100 plus teachers' aide positions. And then in the next year, those positions were immediately cut. And what we learned from that is that we can be successful at issue-based campaigns, but without the political power to sustain those wins, we would be using all of our capacity to run the same campaigns year after year. And I think, supporting C3 organizations is very important. Let me be clear about that. What is also really important is investing and supporting organizations that can run the political power arm that sustains the work that folks are doing. Because it really, what we're able to do and what we're able to sustain over time is a part of our ability to be able to be a part of governing. And I'll pause there.
Thank you. I think that was a really important point. And I think it's worth us mentioning and thinking about how we fund both. I have a friend in this work, a comrade as she calls herself, who always says all the time, fund us like you want us to win. So it's not about funding a part of the strategy. And that person is Ashley Henderson. We all know her. But it's about funding all of the work and making sure that if we're investing in communities, that we're not just investing in part of the strategy, but we're investing in it all, because we want people to be able to do this work and organize in a way where we could see the results of it and see the wins of it and see communities be able to be mobilized and organized and supported. So thank you for lifting that up. And thank you for all of you for sharing those other points around some of the trends that we're seeing. I think
Can I add one more thing?
Sure, absolutely.
This is building on what Kaji said, and I know if people are thinking about the South, especially, they're thinking about voter suppression. But I just want to add the carceral element. I'm in Georgia today, right? And the Secretary of State recently, voter fraud investigations are now falling under the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. If you're working in Florida, yesterday, I think, that Governor DeSantis signed a bill creating the new Florida election police force. And so I think this is the other thing that we're seeing is like where we have wins, and Kaji, you spoke to this directly, right? That, every time we win, there's going to be pushback. And oftentimes when folks have the means to control the state, then it is like using the power of the state to push back against those wins. And so if we look at Florida, and Hayden Norris isn't with us because he was very instrumental after the work that he led in Louisiana and helping Florida to do the work to expand the franchise, right, to folks who had been criminal or disenfranchised because of previous convictions. And so now when we look back to today, right, because they're afraid of the power that we're building, because they're afraid of these coalitions, and the way that we've been able to be so successful at bringing folks in, the criminalization and using that as a tactic is something that we're seeing, I think, across the Southeast. And so just felt like really, really important to name and make sure that folks are attuned to, and again, deeply connected to this safety and security issue, and the reason that we as funders have to invest not only directly in the safety and security of our grantees, but in them having the funding or the means to really think about safety and security for staff, but also for the folks that they're engaging in these processes as they become more and more criminalized.
That's right. Thank you for lifting that up, Melanie.
I think you hit it. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Paulina.
I was going to say, I think you both hit it. I think that is part of what we oftentimes, talk about all the time. Is like, what do we mean by power? And then this point in the South, I feel like in the US, it's like, it is the power to be able to write the rules. And it is the power to be able to protect our people from the backlash that we are in. And we know that we're facing generational backlash from the work that our parents and our grandparents did. Right. And then and the American Indian movement and the farm worker rights movement and the civil rights movement and the Chicano movement, like the LGBTQI movement, we are facing, that's what we're dealing with. And so like, I think that's a question, to share back with other donors is like, what is it, where do we what is our definition of power? What do we think the movements need to win? To your point, Tamika, I think that is something that most organizers that I know that are in it to win it for the long haul are very focused in. And so, I do think that there is, I'm one of those people that I'm like, I don't believe in throwing out the baby with the bathwater. There are many things that are out here that are not perfect. They're not paid for containers. They're not perfect collaborations. And they have, but they have, they hold a significant sort of, I would say, legacy and infrastructure in the South, in that so many of those legacy organizations have helped to build a leadership bench that is now, when you're from the South, the like people that are running a lot of this local and statewide organizations sometimes come out of a very similar ecosystem, come out, of like a set of organizations that were very focused on the same thing, or were sort of already in alignment with each other. And so to me, I'm like, that is part of how we sustain long-term intergenerational leadership in the South, is that we don't take it either or approach. Yes, it's important to support, like legacy organizations. And it's also very important to support new and emerging organizations and formations that are fighting for communities that haven't oftentimes been included at bigger organizations, or their definition of power is taking it, sometimes they want to go a little bit farther than other organizations want to go, and some organizations are very well positioned to do harm reduction work. And they are very aware of that. Some of the legal services that they provide, some of their direct services that they provide, they know that it's not going to take, like their members and their clients to liberation. But you know what? It's a very necessary step to get people to show up to organizing meetings. If people are hungry, if people don't feel safe, if there's not transportation to get there. So I also sometimes feel like there's a lot of shade, around organizations that are just like, they're providing the roots and the infrastructure for people to show up. It's like people want perfect leaders to walk into the door and be like, have a policy agenda and have a sharp power analysis and are not egomaniacs and all these other things. And you're like, well, that doesn't happen by accident. People are like shaped and molded by movements, by organizations, by networks. I think about some of the people that I saw that were on this call, like I think about the Southern Rural Black Women's Initiative, like the work that they've been doing in the Deep South to help and to create not just an organization.
Just got led into a Zoom meeting.
Oh,
sometimes.
Somebody's lost. All right, bye, friend. Hope you find where you're going. Yeah, just I feel like there's organizations like the Southern Rural Black Women's Initiative, like an entire network, of amazing Black feminist leaders, women, oftentimes working in rural communities that are not visible from the national level. Why would they be? Unless we're elevating them, unless we're also aware of the role that they play. Other parts of, to me, I feel like that is part of how we build Southern power, is by showing love to the things that are not oftentimes like, they're not as visible at the national level, or they're not sort of funded by every single private foundation. And I also just encourage people to learn from your public foundation partners. We have incredible collaborations with a number of like other feminist grantmakers are part of. I think about the Australia Lesbian Foundation for Justice. Think about Third Way Foundation. I think about a lot of Urgent Action Fund at the national level, organizations that are thinking about both rapid response funding and also some of them long-term funding, sustainable funding, and that we have to kind of, that's another sort of area, I feel like, where it just cannot be an either or. We can't only have rapid response funding, and we can't only have long-term funding that doesn't come till a year later when communities are really in deep crisis. There were a few other things that I was thinking about in terms of, some of the traditional funding practices really screw up the work that we need to support. Like some of the more traditional ways. So even thinking about a lot of the C3 organizations that are doing incredible work have in the last 10 years grown C4 arms and are really struggling oftentimes to get support for that. Why? Because there's not a shared understanding, right, of like the C4 sort of strategies that a lot of organizations are using to really protect their wins, to really create the political cover that we need to actually win. So we can actually, so that movements actually can be taken on really harmful players in the South. And so I think that there is, to just kind of peel away like the illusion of like, I'm like, some of the stuff is really hard, and it takes a lot of fortitude to like, to do the work of organizations that we support. And we see that oftentimes like, we support work, for example, like around strategic communications and journalism, because we think those two are also really important in terms of narrative change work and investing in the people that are also helping to lift up the narratives, like doing narrative interventions, but also helping to understand the narrative landscape and how the right now is baiting so many people on the left and so many of our movements into a very narrow fight that they have to find. What is a win? What is a lose? And our people are walking into that. Oftentimes the people that are looking at that kind of being like, wait, y'all, why are we even arguing with them? Well, we need to be building our narrative power. Why are we, like all these kinds of things that are very tactical, but also very strategic in terms of helping to protect and sustain movement building in the Southeast. Same thing with journalism. we're really right now investing in trying to learn better, like what is the social justice journalism ecosystem? Who is actually supporting more radical social justice storytelling journalism that is helping to lift up and create the kind of political cover that organizations do need? So with that, the risk that they're taking, everybody knows about it. They're not taking risks in like isolation, or their people are not being, frankly, oftentimes like, you know, kidnapped by the police, and all kinds of things that are happening to people in like anti-criminalization fights where they're facing really sharp power imbalances and there's no buffer. You know, so I do feel like being thoughtful in terms of Grantmakers being like, if we're not the ones as private donors, then let's get in closer, loving collaboration with some private foundations and private, you know, other folks that have been thinking really thoughtfully about participatory grant making, how to have more, you know, voice leader, more movement leaders, be part of the decisions that are made around where resources go. I think about, you know, one of the efforts y'all have been really supportive of, Tamika, the Southern Power Fund, being one of those other like high level experiments, interventions, vision, and a dream. But I mean, it actually plays that decision-making power into the hands of Southern movement anchors to say, we know that there's a bunch of tiny organizations and collectives that we're not in touch with. We don't have the capacity to like even support, to be real. It's like private foundations and donors. It's like, why are we even pretending that we can reach all these like tiny little formations, you know, versus actually like just being in strategic partnership with you all. So I'll stop there.
So, and I think where Paulina is going is we're talking about what you're lifting up is how people think about how we're funding this work, how you're redistributing resources through the work that you're doing. And I think that's a good place for us to dive into. And so, Melanie, is there anything outside of what Paulina has lifted up that you'd like to add to that? Because I think it's important for us to think about how we fund this work and how we don't pigeonhole ourselves in the different ways in which we could redistribute money through the work that you all are doing.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I'm just thinking, and you know, at GSP, we've been in conversation with folks kind of across the region, particularly in the intermediary space, because it is popping right now and it is very, very different, right? There are so many people, I think, at like hyper local level that are leading intermediaries, whether that looks like mutual aid funds, right? That are responding to the very real and material conditions in their communities on the ground. And like, how and why are they like so disconnected from this space, particularly because I think they have lots of voice and insight. And Paulina, to your point, like the Southern Power Fund, that traditional philanthropy is not reaching those communities and not reaching it right at the level that like some of these formations are. And so what does it look like for us to be in deeper relationship and alignment? But, you know, I'll also just say, you know, our founding was really an answer to a call that Black, Brown, Indigenous, particularly women that are at the front line leading so much of this climate work are not showing up on budget sheets. And even when we go to, you know, all these environment or climate gatherings where they're showing up loud, taking up so much space on the agenda. And so when we hear the conversation that's being had in these funder spaces, it makes you feel like there's been a shift. But I'll tell you, and I know that some of you all know as well, you know, when you look at the budgets, then you're like, wait, what? And so the fact that we're 2.5 years old and some organizations that have existed for 30 years that were perennially coming into these environmental spaces, I'm like, wait, we gave you your first multi-year grant? Like that still blows my mind. It's absurd, it's ridiculous. This is not like an accolade that we want, right? We don't want to be the first. There should not be any more first in this space. But you know, when I think a bit about kind of what this looks like, what some of the kind of trends that we're seeing, and I think what feels really important in terms of redistributing money is that it's about power, right? It's about people being able to make the decisions about this wealth. And if we think about the wealth of philanthropy as excess that does not exist without the exploitation of our people and our communities, then it's about how do we create vehicles that give them the power and the space to decide about what we do with that excess, right? Or what we do with those resources. And so the Hive Fund, when we started, before we made a single grant, we brought, you know, leaders together in Atlanta and had about 3 days together to say, hey, if you had to dream up a fund that was like different from any other funds that you had, what would it look like? And, you know, we knew that we wanted to be participatory starting out, but asking the question, what does that mean? And what does that look like for people, particularly for like leaders who are like, I have to run my own organization, show up for my board, show up in my community. And as funders, you want me to show up to all these participatory processes so you can feel good about yourself. And so it was really like, how do we have conversations about the level of participation that makes sense? And like for us, it came in at the strategic participation. Like we want to set strategy. We want to have these conversations and we want to learn together in ways that may also help us to lead our organizations in ways or understand better, the context in which we're leading our organizations. And we want to be able to come in for every grant cycle and say, yes, no, we have questions about these organizations that you're putting before us. But really, it's like, okay, how do we lead on a strategic level? And so we're set up, we have an advisory board that is 2/3 line leaders, primarily people of color from the South. But then we also have a participatory decision-making working group that guides us at that strategic level. We also work really closely with our grantee partners to shape our strategy from cycle to cycle. And so if you're in, then we write a huge, huge grant memo. We have lots of conversations and you have a piece of it that you get to say, hey, this is what we really need in Georgia. I know that we're building towards this work. We're a part of your collective here in Georgia, but this is what feels like it's missing. Have you considered these organizations? This is what we need to build either the people, the economic, or the cultural power to move this work forward in a durable way. And so that's a little bit about what participation looks like from our side. But I think the other thing that it looks like is specific grants. Like we fund multi-year, 3-year general operating support grants, but we can't be dogmatic about that. Like I'm in conversations with leaders and I was talking to a leader who was like, I really need an executive assistant. I don't know, if my board is going to sign off on this. And so having a conversation, well, what does that mean? Do we need to restrict some of this funding so that like you can have the space you need to actually get what you need? And we as a funder can deal with that, so that particularly as we're working with women of color leaders, we're saying, oh, I'm the first woman of color to lead my organization. There are gender issues that come up, even in like Black-led or people of color-led organizations where trust looks different for women, for LGBTQ, for trans folks. And how do we give them cover, even in the way that we make our grants so that they can get what they need to be successful leaders? And so it is participatory on that intimate, like, how do we structure this grant so it works for you? But it's also at the strategy level and, at our kind of higher level of, advisory board. So I will, I guess, leave it there. And I know that there was a specific request to hear from Kaji about what participatory budgeting looks like and participation looks like in your work.
Yeah. And Kaji, before you answer that, and I know we only have a few minutes left, and I really want you to also share with us some of the best ways your work have been supported and the ways that, and in addition to that, what ways have you needed support and you haven't received it? You're on mute, Kaji.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, often get sidetracked. So I'm sorry, I missed the question about the participatory budgeting. What was that?
We'll get to that one because I think that was one of the questions that popped up in the queue. But if you could answer for us, like one of the ways, thinking about how Paulina and Melanie have lifted up different ways that they've been creative in funding movement work, I wanted to see if you could share some of the best ways that you have been supported and in ways in which you have not gotten supported to do the work that needs to be done in the communities that you're serving.
Right. So for me personally, I came up through this organization. So I was a member leader, a coach, on the board chair, and then I'm the first ED of this organization. And I think when you invest in leadership of folks coming up through, the hall, I guess is the term, coming up through the hall, is there needs to be consideration for like, what are the leadership development needs and opportunities, and how do we build organization around like that and support around that. So for newer EDs and EDs in general, I think having a coach is super helpful. being able to have more of a like advisory cabinet that is more informal, that is there to support leadership is super helpful as well. I think on a different tip, capacity, anything that builds out capacity is absolutely needed, and it's really great when it happens. So support from people coming from out of state to help door knock with us. There was an amazing moment for Durham For All to be able to work with BOLD, which is Black Organizing for Leadership and Dignity. They had an Amandala program, which they trained folks on how to organize. Their program wasn't like, here's a program, then how we will like implement the organizing long term. They're like, we need our folks to know these skills. And they joined up with us to be able to be like, great, what are y'all up to? How do we support door knocking? So they got a praxis with their training. So putting together both like ideas of the world and the practice together is essentially practice. Like you get to pull the two things in, and we got support and they got support with their folks being able to sharpen their skills in real time about something that they learned and then implement it. That was deeply helpful for us to be able to reach hundreds of residents across Durham and invite them into our work, let them know that we exist, like continue to build those relationships. So when I think of support, I'm like, oh, those things. And I think, for C4 organizations, unrestricted partisan political funds and multi-year commitments to organizations doing work. And for smaller C4 organizations, in the odd years, it is deeply hard to fundraise C4 funds because there's no giant election happening. But in Durham, we have an election every year. We have no rest for the for folks in Durham around elections, but multi-year funding, and I would say stepped funding, like a higher funding in the odd years to help keep the organization rolling into even years so that we're able to continue and do the work that's needed to sustain, our wins. I think some of the things that's lacking is, I think more kind of a program and a connection between relationships of funder to organizations and institutions. So like, how do we get in when you're a smaller organization, you're a little fly, amongst like many other organizations and bigger, maybe more well-known, moving around. How do we make those connections for those smaller organizations to be able to have access and conversations with those who don't even know we exist? My thing is, statewide organizations are only as strong as their local. And we're a local of Carolina Federation, who's the left statewide infrastructure in North Carolina. And it is really something to be moving with other chapters and affiliates towards a shared vision of what we want not only Durham, but North Carolina as a whole to look like. And so, yeah, isn't my time's up, huh? Tamika's keeping me on time. All right, thank you.
I don't want to. I want you to keep talking. We never build in enough time for these things. We need to build more time because I think these are very important and critical conversations that we're having, and there's just so many points. So what I am going to do is just ask for permission from Amber, who's like my boss in the background, giving me the hand, to let's give each of you like 30 seconds to just wrap up the things that you feel were important highlights that at the end of the day, when people end this conversation, that you want them to walk away with. And we'll start with Paulina.
Well, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. We know that a lot of us have, I think these are really hard political times with a lot of contradictions. And I think we, somebody reminded me the other day that they were like, remember when we were doing all those fundraising meetings and nobody really believed in our little scrappy organizing strategy. And we were like, y'all need to be like, y'all need to do better. Like, now we're those people, like now we're those people that are like, wait, what are y'all doing over there? And it's like, sometimes we like completely understand their strategy from beginning to end. And sometimes they're making a really radical intervention that it's going to play out, and like we have to invest in new possibilities for the South, people that are actually invested in helping to intervene on some of the conditions, helping to share power, helping to model something different. So I'm excited to be supporting a new generation of feminist leaders, but also seeing where the gaps are and how we can coordinate better to help fill them. Thank y'all for this conversation. Thank you, Grantmakers for Southern Progress, because I feel like y'all are really good also teaching people Southern manners. It's one thing we need to engage in the region. If you don't know nothing else, it's some Southern manners. I feel like y'all have, just creating a center of gravity for like, this is what it means to be in right relation with organizations. And here's how some ways to, help level the playing field. Here's some ways to like help, not model really problematic power dynamics that are very endemic to like philanthropy, and how do we not, break some of those cycles in the ways that we can. Just appreciate y'all's work around that. So definitely we'll be leaning on you all.
We're going to get to those questions, but I just want to give them just a few seconds to wrap up their final thoughts around this discussion. And then I'll turn it over to Amber after. We're going to send it to Melanie and then Kaja, and then I'll send it to Amber to get maybe one or two questions in before we have to wrap.
Well, thank you. I, will just kind of underscore the appreciation that Paulina already offered for Grantmakers for Southern Progress, and for everyone who made time to join this conversation today. As I think of maybe two things that, I'm hoping that folks take with them. I don't know if it's been said as explicitly. Actually, I think Paulina, you said it very well, that, all of this is relational. And in the South especially, but everywhere, I'm kind of like hearing the words of Gladys Washington, relationships are infrastructure. And so I think that is really important or really key when we think about, what we're investing in. Investing in leaders, I've seen so much, and I think people have been, saying a lot about like what it looks like to transition, right? In the space of like new leadership, old leadership, what happens like with legacy organizations, emerging organizations. And so just in our funding and in our funding practice, but also in our organizing, because at the end of the day, I think so many of us come from organizing and are organizers, that it really does go down to that relationship and taking the time to think about what it looks like to care for people and to care for a community, particularly as it's in a point of transition. And so I'll hold that. And then also, I think this piece that just is becoming more and more clear and apparent in our work is this healing, justice, and holistic security, that this is work that we have to do and that we have to do together. And so I know that this has been about capacity building, and a lot of questions that we're holding, this is what we heard from grantee partners. And so we did some deep learning and are still learning together with grantee partners about this, is that we've got to support this healing work. And so for us at the Hive Fund, healing, justice, and holistic security is the support needed to help Black, Indigenous, other women, non-binary folks of color and their communities to heal, transform, and be protected from the harmful effects of intergenerational and ongoing trauma, violence, pollution, and weathering from white supremacy and sexism. And so it's really important that we hold not only building the capacity for today, like this is the landscape, but we're holding in generational trauma. And so we have to tend to both of those if we're going to be able to move forward in vision and right relationship with each other, particularly with the power that we need as a movement. And so I think those are two things that I hope that folks, continue to think and talk about and take with them from this conversation.
Thanks, Melanie.
Yeah, thanks, Grantmakers for Southern Progress. I'm thinking about, we got a chance to really dive deep into quite a few of like what's working, what's not working. And I kind of want to bring it back to a little bit of what Paulina and Melanie was talking about it's like about people. I want to share a little bit of the context of the spirit of the work. Because as we support and fund these organizations and movement and infrastructure, what does it mean? What is the spirit of it? So I want to share, a little bit about myself around that. I moved around a lot when I was growing up, and I didn't live in a community that looked like me or shared my identity, nor my family's cultural practices. And I was really kind of consistently trying to figure out where I fit in and where I belonged. Essentially, who are my people and who did I belong to and who belonged to me? And I share this because I know this isn't a feeling that's actually specific to me, but a shared feeling amongst the many conversations I've had over the years with folks. And it really made me wonder, how are we seeing ourselves reflected back in the world? And at the core of what we're really up to is really changing the political climate that will reflect back to us the inherent truth of our own belonging. And what that looks like is that we have healthcare, that when we get sick, we can take a day off and we're still able to get paid, that our kids are able to get the quality education that they deserve, and that we have access to affordable housing. There's so many ways that the world's showing us how we don't belong. And at the core of the work is really for us to shift and change that and reflect back to us the truth of belonging. For Durham For All, the work that we're up to is creating a political home for people across difference, that's race and class, and for folks to be able to see enough of themselves inside of it to feel at home. And we are creating a culture inviting people in over and over to the point that folks expect to hear from us about what we're hearing, what's happening, what can be done about it, and how can they join in to make change. And that their gifts and their contributions are actually valued, they're needed for our movements to actually flourish. Because often we know the experience of our folks, sometimes taking positions of, well, I don't know enough. Other folks making them feel as if they're on the outside of this work when they are at the core of our work. So our local level work has really been, how do we build political organization that centers leadership of people of color and the multiracial working class? And at the same time, working across race and class. And if y'all are wondering, does that mean white folks? I'm gonna say, yes, it does. I said it. I know some folks shy away from the W word, but the truth of the matter is we need each other. We need everyone, because we can't win alone, and we can't win without a deep investment in our folks' political education, their understanding of the larger strategy in order to sustain our folks long-term. Because change isn't won or lost in one election or an issue-based campaign, it's a long-term strategy. So if anything, that's what I leave you with. Thank you.
Kaji, that was beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for joining us for all of our panel as well as our audience today. I'm going to turn this over to questions from the audience really quickly. And before I do that, I have a shameless plug for GSP, just based on some of the questions that have popped up. You guys, there's 2 questions in the chat that talked about how we build space for new leaders to grow and how we give opportunity for philanthropic folks to be connected to the folks who are doing this work on the ground. And GSP is developing a program to do just that. It's called the Race and Gender Equity Cohort. If you have not heard about it, we are launching it this September and applications go live next week. You can learn more about it on the GSP website, but that's not why we're here today. So I will slide into one of the other questions that we have. Alita looks like asked that we really have a conversation around how do we make sure that we are being responsive to the ever-changing things that are happening in our landscape. How do we make sure that folks can stay connected and really get a good understanding with COVID and all the legislative issues going on to really be connected to what's happening for new organizing and really offering community education. So when shifts like this are happening, how does philanthropy respond and even know about the necessary shifts that are going on? I'll pass it over to whoever wants to jump in, but Kaji, I feel like you would have a great perspective to say, as a person who's moving this work on the ground, how do we make sure that philanthropy is connected? And then Paulina, if you want to jump in. Melanie, I know you have a hard stop, so if we lose you along the way, thank you, and we'll see you later.
Melanie, you're not leaving yet, are you? Because I feel like actually what you
I'm
were
here,
sharing.
I'm here.
Okay. Is it all right, Amber, if I pass it over to Melanie? Because you were talking about doing a tour with folks, and I think that's perfect for this answer or for this question.
Yeah. I mean, I can say 2 words, but I think definitely we want to hear from you and your work on the ground, Kaji. I'll say one, for us, it is that we, are participatory, and so built into our model, frontline leaders that we're meeting with at least quarterly, who are, shaping strategy, because we know it is always emergent and things change, and we're revisiting it that frequently, right? To say, does this still hold true? Is this still what we need? Is this still what makes sense? But also what they said from us, we were like talking about maybe convening, and they were like, actually, we need to go see about our people. And so we planned, and today is the first day be on the road through June of our, listening and solidarity tour, where we're taking time to go see about our people, understand, what's going on, what's top of mind for them, what they need, what they're excited about, and try to pull it together to reflect that back so that we can have, yes, this is what we're hearing from specific grantees, but across North Carolina, like as we are building up to like, hey, this is what folks are working toward together. This is how we reflect it back. This is how we may learn together and closer to real time, instead of just like, having to learn everything our own. So we're building towards a collective impact, shared learning. That's very small CI, not big CI, but shared learning kind of relationship that's being shaped by grantee partners, but also really just coming to see about them. And I'd say absent coming to see about them in that way, just having open lines of communication. And so I think it looks different for everyone, but like, my grantee partners text me. They're like, hey, did you see this? So I think it's figuring out what makes sense to you and what kind of relationship you want to be in with your grantee partners, knowing that may be that you get texts, at whatever, if you're trying to be in real relationship, but it also means that folks feel really comfortable being vulnerable and not just showing you the good, but like showing the difficult and the messy.
Melanie. Kaji, did you have anything to add from your perspective, how funders can stay engaged and really know what's going on with movement organizations?
Yeah, I'm gonna say we want what Melanie said. We want to be connected. We want to be able to share the cute and the ugly tears where you just snot down the face and like, hey, this is hard. And to be able to hold the complexity together about what's trying to happen. Yeah, I don't have much else. I think it's really good to be in connection, other than being like, what I hear Melody saying is, what do you need? How are you doing? And I think my experience has often been, what do you got? And so I just want to, that's just as simple as I could say it.
That's beautiful. Well, I think we are at the end of our time, everyone. So I want to say thank you again for joining us. I think the theme of today's conversation is to be in relationship, not only with the folks that are on the ground working, but with each other, and kind of help build and share strategy and make sure that we're all lined up together. Thank you again to our panel, and we look forward to doing this again with the same group of you, if not more of you, next month at our May 26th webinar, where we tackle racial justice and combating Christian white nationalism. Thank you again, and see you soon.